Okay, and welcome. My name is Andy Silow-Carroll. I am the editor-at-large of the New York Jewish Week and the managing editor for Ideas at the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. I want to welcome you all to the discussion of Jewish and New York language. I'll start by telling you a little story I stumbled over this weekend. I was at a reading of Philip Roth's The Plot Against America. And he says this about his childhood in Newark, New Jersey, just across the river, right? From where I am anyway. Hardly anyone in the vicinity spoke with an accent. By 1940, Jewish parents and their children at the southwestern corner of New Jersey's largest city talked to one another in an American English that sounded more like the language spoken in Altoona or Binghamton than like the dialects famously spoken across the Hudson by our Jewish counterparts in the 5 boroughs. So this evening, we're going to talk about the dialects famously spoken across the Hudson, how the New York accent and New York vocabulary got that way, how it became one of the most recognizable regional dialects in North America, and what role Jews played in shaping, and still shaping, language in New York. Helping us tell that story are Sarah Bunin Benor. She's the vice provost and professor of contemporary Jewish studies and linguistics at Hebrew Union College, the Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles. And she's the adjunct professor in the University of Southern California Linguistics Department. She also founded and directs the HUC-JAR Jewish Language Project, and she runs my favorite website, which is the Jewish English Lexicon, which is a crowdsourced dictionary of all the crazy things Jews say to each other. We're also joined by Michael Newman, a professor of linguistics at Queens College and the Graduate Center of the City of New York and the author of New York City English. He's also the co-creator of the CUNY Corpus of New York City English, which has some 2 million words, not all transcribed, and how they are distinctly spoken and used by New Yorkers of all types. And just before we start, I want to thank the staff at 70 Faces Media, who helps put together these and other New York Jewish Week events, especially Thea Wieseltier, Becky Phillips, and Mira Zulali. So welcome. I want to start by showing a little video, just a bit of it, that will kind of set us up for what we're talking about when we talk about New York English. I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. And now I have to figure out how to do this. Hang in there. Well, actually, I'm going to unshare because I don't have what I have, but I'm going to first, going to go to, hold on one second. Technical difficulties, folks, just hang in there. I'm going to start with Michael. Michael, what are the distinct aspects of the New York accent and the New York vocabulary? How do we say how does Bernie speak?
Bernie, right? Bernie's been Bernie, along with Donald Trump, I have to say, is our two major exponents of New York City speech. And a while back, I had the idea that got around was that Bernie's way of speaking got associated, Bernie and Trump also got associated with positive characteristics, which is kind of unusual. But let's go directly to what these features are. We call it linguistics features. And there are certain features that are kind of notorious, like the vowel or, particularly in the word coffee, but that vowel anywhere, if it's in dog, you can say, or thought, that vowel is considered very distinctly New York, although to a certain extent it's shared also traditionally in Philadelphia. There's also the awlessness, the dropping of the R after a vowel, which I don't do. I do have the coffee vowel, the thought vowel. And then there are features that are less well known, but people pick up on. So, for example, people can be aware of. Traditionally, although this is not as we've seen a decline in this one considerably, is a different vowel in cash, for example, than cap. And even less noticed is the pronunciation of the T, the D, the S sounds, which in almost every variety of English is put up on that part of the lip the part above your teeth that you burn with the pizza when you eat pizza. That part that gets burned. That's most people pronounce it by hitting their tongue there, but so they say talk, dog. But many New Yorkers do it on the teeth, so it's talk and dog with a little like that, a little different. So those are features which nobody notices, but we can sort of linguists can use as sort of a diagnosis. And then there are a few other things with vocabulary that's tending to spread out everywhere. So it's becoming less common to have, but there are new words like which represent new products, such as, and maybe many of you don't know it, but a nutcracker. I don't know how many people know what a nutcracker is, or a nutty. That's what people are selling fruit illegally in bodegas and on the streets. And bodega is another good one. We don't say corner store or convenience store. We say bodega.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a few of those.
What about
online, meaning standing online? That's a
so what's the New York way of queuing up?
We get online. Yeah.
Get online. Yeah.
Right. That's right. We get online.
Sarah, you're in California. How do you queue?
We get inline.
Get inline. Okay, great. Let me just see if I can try this video one more time, and just to give you an idea of what Professor Newman just explained, which is right here, and this is from a New York Times contest for the best accent in New York, and here you go.
No, we're seeing an email.
An email.
You're seeing an email. All right, then I'm not doing this. Okay, I was told it'd be easy.
I think I can.
My next question is, and Michael, if you can call it up, that'd be great. But my next question is for Sarah. What this distinct accent? What in what ways was what is this distinct vocabulary or conversational style of New Yorkers, and how is that shaped by Jews?
Sure. So let me share my screen, if that's okay. Or do you want to wait until Michael pulls up that video?
I want to see anybody who's more successful.
New York Chapter.
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay, you just have to share screen.
Okay, hold on. Come on, it changed where I was.
See, I'm not the only one. I'm going to pretend I don't have a New York City accent, so that it doesn't help that.
New York accent.
Best New York accent.
So last week, I noticed that Nico Heller, who's someone I follow on Instagram, was putting together a Best New York Accent challenge.
All these people are emailing me this link to apply for a New York accent contest on Instagram.
You worried about a New York accent?
I'm like, apply for an accent contest on Instagram?
You don't have nothing else better to do?
So Nicholas Heller, New York Nico, his subjects are often characters who are just literally on your corner.
Listen, my buddy Nico got a thing going on about the best New York accent.
Nico told me he was putting together a best New York accent contest. You already know.
I got the best New York accent, New York Nico.
Shout out to New York Nico.
For the past 4 or 5 years, I've been running this Instagram account called New York Nico. Where
okay, I think is that enough?
Yep, that does it. So Sarah, I'll throw it back to you. As I said, like, what's unique about it, and also how is this? Where is the Jewish in all this in shaping this kind of this way of speaking and talking?
Sure. So I'll share just a few images. There's an interesting dissertation by Deborah Tannen about a Thanksgiving dinner in the 1970s that included some California non-Jews and some New York Jews. And the New York Jews had a very different way of speaking, a conversational style that she characterized as high engagement. They overlapped a lot. And if anyone ever says you interrupt, you can say, I'm not interrupting, I'm just overlapping. And what that means is you're speaking and then the next person starts speaking before you finish your utterance. And then there's also this idea of Jewish argumentation as sociability. An article by Deborah Schifrin about that focuses on how we argue, and that might be seen as conflictual, but we just see it as engaged. We just see it as we're showing interest, and this is how we normally interact. And because of this distinctive New York Jewish way of speaking, there are sometimes problems among people who are not New Yorkers and people who are not Jewish. Now, it's not just a New York thing, and it's not just a Jewish thing, and it's certainly not just a New York Jewish thing. But I actually have some data on this particular question from a survey that I conducted in 2008. We had over 25,000 Jewish respondents and 4,800 non-Jewish respondents. And so I'm just going to present a little bit of data from that here right now. This is, we asked, have you ever been told that your speech style is too aggressive? And we found that that Jews were more likely than non-Jews to say yes. But if they lived in New York as a child, both groups were more likely to say yes to that. And even if they lived in New York as an adult, they were a bit more likely to say yes to that, especially if they were Jewish. But even if they had never lived in New York, it's still a large percentage of Jews that say yes to that. But note that non-Jews do as well. And so it's really not an across the board thing. It's just we can see a quantitative difference there. So do you also want me to talk about Yiddish words?
Sure, but let's talk about language style a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
I've also heard, I think it was the same Deborah Tannen study, that New Yorkers, and it feels Jewish to me, but I don't know if it is, but New Yorkers see a gap in conversation as a chance to jump in, where Californians or maybe people who are not in New York see it as just, I'm gathering my thoughts. And that's where some of that conflict comes from. Is that?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Great. And Michael, help us understand how immigrants of any type shape a native language, or not a native language, but the current language and the interplay among them. How does that shape the local variants of English?
It's one of the founders of the field that I work within, and Sarah also, William Lebov, had an article called what he called the mystery of the substrate. So substrate is the term that we were using to speak the community language that was shifted into a different language. So for Ashkenazi Jews in New York, even if you are a monolingual English speaker, you may have like what we call a Yiddish substrate, right? Because that's the language that our grandparents, our great-grandparents, our parents speak, even if we don't speak it. So that's our substrate. And he had this article called The Mystery of the Substrate, because no one knows how that works and whether it'll even happen. So, for example, at one point, New York was half German, but there's no trace of anything German in New York City English. Why did that happen? On the other hand, there's quite a lot of little bits of Yiddish that have come into New York City. And very often, so for example, that dental, that pronunciation is from Yiddish, but it's also from Italian, and it's also from Spanish. So there we have a little bit of a reason why maybe something else, why a particular feature comes from one language is because it's shared. And another thing is the social prominence of the speakers. So Jews are very much a part of New York. They've historically we've been very closely identified with New York. So a lot of people who might be from a Cuban background or a Black African-American background will know Schlepp they'll declining maybe now, but people are familiar with some of these words because they're kind of culturally cool.
Nosh, certainly. Right.
Yeah. And then some of them get like glitch. Like no one knows that comes from Yiddish. But there we go.
We heard in that video different accents. They had a lot of similarities, but they also had some differences. How is the New York accent changing and why?
Well, that video is a little bit misleading because it's what we call a dialect performances that people were doing. We don't know whether those people really speak that way normally. I mean, you do find those features. It's not that unusual to hear a lot of the way that those people are speaking, but it was still a performance that they were putting on to win this contest and to show off on Instagram. In any case, what we would want to say about New York is that there really isn't a New York City English, that there are New York City Englishes, and that they may resemble each other in certain ways, like the way that members of a family resemble each other. So they'll have an African American who will speak what we call African American English. Will still probably, if you think about someone, famous rappers like Nas or Jay-Z, they have that wa vowel, which a Dirty South rapper wouldn't have, or an LA rapper wouldn't have. And you can hear that in a lot of the Latino New Yorkers. But it's changing now. A lot of those very stereotypical features are in decline. We don't really hear them, and new features are arising. So New Yorkers don't sound like people in Sarah's neck of the woods, but younger ones don't often have a lot of those very stereotypical features.
I should just ask this quickly, Michael, where'd you grow
up? Jackson Heights.
Okay. Because I heard often, which is probably how I would do it if I grew up on Long Island. I'm supposed to say Long Island, but I don't do it, probably because I've trained myself not to. Sarah, where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Rockville, Maryland, a suburb of Washington, D.C., but my parents spent some of their childhood in New York, and because of that, I have some New York features in my speech. And in fact, Jews are more likely than non-Jews, if they're not from New York, to have features of New York speech.
So explain that. How does that happen?
Yeah. Well, is it okay if I show an image about that too?
Sure.
Okay, let me pull that up. So on the survey, we asked if people if they had been told that they sound like they're from New York. And so here is that slide. So we found that this was just among Americans who did not grow up in New York, that Jews were more likely than non-Jews to say that people have told them that they sound like they're from New York. Now, that could just be because Jews are more likely to have spent time in New York, and maybe they picked up some New York features as adults. So we also asked that question. We also asked if they've ever lived in New York, and we asked if their parents had grown up in New York. And even among those who have never lived in New York and whose parents did not grow up there, Jews were more likely than non-Jews to say that people have told them they sound like they're from there. About a quarter of Jews in America in our sample reported that. And so what features are they talking about? Well, we asked about two of them. So there's a feature in New York English where they distinguish between the words Mary, Mary, and Mary. Now, notice I said that all the same. That's because that's how I say them. But in New York, and actually, maybe Michael, do you want to pronounce those three words and say which one you're saying?
First one is M-A-R-Y, Mary, and then Mary, slightly different. And that's happy, and like Merry Hanukkah. And marry, which is getting together with another person. Yeah.
Okay, great. So Mary, and marry. And we asked specifically about Mary and Mary, and we found that Jews were more likely than non-Jews to say that they distinguish between them. And then we also asked about the vowel in the words orange, horrible, and Florida. And notice I said them like a New Yorker, right? That's one interesting weird feature of my speech, whereas most of my peers growing up in Maryland would have said orange, horrible, and Florida. But we found that Jews were more likely than non-Jews to report that they say that vowel in the New York way. And this is even among people who've never lived there and whose parents did not grow up there. So what's going on here? I think this has to do with New York being a center of Jewish community, and people have networks of people who have spent time in New York or grew up in New York, even if they've never lived there. So I think that's a feature of Jewish speech in America more generally. And actually, this is an interesting connection to other Jewish languages. Like in Judeo-Italian, you see some features from the south of Italy in the north. And in Judeo-Arabic, if you live in Egypt, you're likely to use some features of Moroccan Judeo-Arabic in your Egyptian Judeo-Arabic. And this, I think, really reflects Jews being a little bit more mobile than their non-Jewish neighbors and maintaining contacts with Jewish communities in other parts of their land.
Okay. Let me ask a question about class, because I'm told that the New York accent, possibly because it's so recognizable, but it's also, I don't know, there's a lot of sociological factors. It is often considered the least desirable accent outside of New York, to the degree that New Yorkers try to lose it when they go abroad, when they cross the Hudson. So my question is, to how much, and Michael, how much is class part of the New York accent? I know it's switched over the years, that a New York accent was highfalutin, and then at some point it became déclassé. So can you talk a little about how that works into perceptions of class?
Well, I could talk about that for about the rest of the session. The brief version, which I think it's important to see where the class issue came from. It was really from racism. There's a book by a sociologist called Tom Bonfiglio, who identified the de-prestige of the lack of prestige of New York City English as arising from it being the speech of immigrants who were not considered white enough. I think it's an exaggeration to say that the early Jews were not white, like an absolute thing, but Jews, Italians, and probably and Irish too were not white enough. So that shifted the prestige to where the real Americans, in quotes, lived, which was in the Midwest and to the West. So that happened during the time of the xenophobia it began with the immigration wave and really took effect in terms of seeing how the lack of how New York appears in movies. You can see work by a sociolinguist from Montreal called Charles Boberg shows how New York accents changed from being the stars to going down into being these sort of characters types in Hollywood movies over the course of the 20th century. But now it's reversed again, and we think of to a certain extent that the Wall Street bro type that can be a pretty clear New York speech. We think of somebody like what's his name, Jamie Dimon, clearly from Jackson Heights, went to my school, but that's a New York. He has a New York accent, and again, Trump, is from Jamaica States. So the prestige, and people, it's interesting when you ask kids today, what do you think of New York? They don't have any sense that it was ever something you didn't want to talk like. That's gone completely. I just said gone.
Sure. But okay. Interesting. I've always been talked about, I mean, even, the Roosevelt R, I hate war, Eleanor hate, but that was a class thing that actually became, lower class as the years went by.
Right. Even the Boyd.
The Boyd. I heard, is that true? The Boyd, say that. The Boyd
it was
thing
prestige. It was, I think, Teddy Roosevelt. There's not many recordings of him, but I think that's the way he said it.
He said Boyd, toity-toid and all that.
Yeah. Well, probably not Tweedy, because that was Irish.
That was Irish.
It would have been Tweedy.
Okay. Sarah, I want to talk a little about the ways, and that might actually brings us up to how Jewish language is changing today, which is the ways how are the ways Jews speak shaped by the non-Jewish languages they encounter. So, and I'm thinking about Yinglish and Yeshivish, which are these emerging, I don't know if the word is dialects, but they're these hybrids that draw on a whole new vocabulary, a whole new accent, that some people would even say was becoming a new kind of Jewish language.
Yeah, right. Well, wherever Jews have lived around the world, they've usually picked up the local language and Judaified it. They've spoken the local language like Judeo-Arabic or Judeo-Greek or Judeo-Italian, Jewish Malayalam in southern India. And we Jews in America are doing the same thing. We're speaking English, but with distinctive features. And those distinctive features include Hebrew and Aramaic words from our texts, but also modern Hebrew words from Israel because of American Jews' connection to Israel, and also especially Yiddish words because of the major influence of Yiddish-speaking immigrants on American communities. And in certain communities that aren't Ashkenazi, you have other languages that are influencing it, like in the Bukharian community, for example. There's an influence of Bukharian or Judeo-Tajik. In the Syrian Jewish community, you have influences from Judeo-Arabic. In the Sephardic community in Seattle, for example, you have Ladino words. But even in these non-Ashkenazi communities, you also sometimes have Yiddish words because they've become part of Jewish English, like shul and daven and bench. And these are words in the religious domain. Shul means synagogue, daven means pray, bench means to bless or say grace after meals. And sometimes the ways that Orthodox Jews speak English is so distinct that you would need subtitles in a movie to understand it. And so that's where it gets at the question you sort of obliquely referenced, which is this a dialect or a language? And I don't think that's a particularly useful distinction, but sometimes people make that distinction based on whether they're mutually intelligible. Here, let me show you some videos and see if you can understand it. And I'm going to show you some videos of, one is a Hasidic woman. It's actually a comedian imitating Hasidic women, but she is an ex-Hasidic Jew herself, Leah Forster. And here's that video, just a quick clip.
So for the egg roll, it's a very particular, you have to saute and you have to do just right. And if you could get your hands on a delicious jalapeno pepper, it's gonna be delicious. You put it in like this, and then if you really want to plate it so it should be stunning, you go like this. You add like a nice little matzav and viola.
Okay, so you could hear stunning. So her vowel was o, and that's definitely an influence from Yiddish. And the ink at the end, it's called final devoicing, where you have an ing, and then the g is actually pronounced, but then it's devoiced. It goes from g to k, so goink. And this is common in Hasidic communities, that you have influences from Yiddish on their spoken English. But then among men in Yeshivish communities, you have more distinctive language where you really do need the subtitles to understand it. And here you see subtitles in Yeshivish. So if you don't know the words, that's okay, but let me just show you how different it is.
Rabbi Zai, I'm a sheretz, so I have to make Esrim keep me away from you, your food, your clothing, and your kalim. So it's a tremendous pella. I'm such a hush of a pot to say the Tyrus, but I've never actually seen to say the Tyrus because the Bachar my Dira doesn't let me near his svarim. Sometimes when I die, I like to bungee jump into a giant kli cheres. Sometimes when I die, I go to the mikvah to see who's toiveling and then I jump into his hands. Oh, gets him every time. Sometimes when I die, I go to a kohen's house and eat his truma bered. It's mamish excellent shtick.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
No, I just said nebech, you know.
All right.
Right. Yeah, I've seen. I'm always proud of myself when I understand Yeshivish because it means I haven't forgotten everything from Hebrew school. But I'm not dealing with the question gufa, right? Let me put it to you, pashut. And then the Hebrew. There's also the Hebrew influence, which is, and that I see code switching. I'll use balagan with my friends who I'm pretty sure will understand what that means. It means a big tzimus. In Hebrew, but I find, but if I'm, I move outside my comfortable little bubble, I just say it's a big mess.
Yeah, absolutely. People are usually aware of the distinctive features that they're using, especially when they're lexical, when they're words. If they're distinctive accents or intonations or even grammatical features, they're not always aware of those distinctive features, but when it's words, they usually are. So usually people are able to code switch like that to temper their use of Hebrew and Yiddish words when they're speaking to outsiders.
What about locutions that there's a few people have asked on the chat, which is the by, which is who's having Shabbat by you. I'm going to be by the assumption is that's directly from Yiddish. That's made its way into Jewish
that's
English.
Definitely a Yiddish influence. The English word by has a different usage than the Yiddish word by, but in Jewish English, it's very similar to how it's used in Yiddish, like saying staying by us, or by the Seder, we do this, meaning at our house.
Right. Someone did ask in the chat, can someone translate the video for us, for those who are lost? I would almost say a lot would be lost in translation, but
yeah, and I'll just also say about by, you asked before about how it's changing. Well, surprisingly, that feature is becoming more common. If you look at the age distribution, you find that younger Orthodox Jews are much more likely than older Orthodox Jews to use by. And in my book, Becoming From, I talk about how newcomers to Orthodox communities pick up that feature and other features as a way of being part of the community and expressing their membership in Orthodox communities. So they might think it's bad grammar, but many of them still use it because they feel like it's important as to show that they're now Orthodox.
Mm-hmm. I also noticed what I like to think of as the Jewish future present tense, which is, are you here for Pesach? I'm by my in-laws on Shabbat. The present becomes the future. Tell me about, Michael, some other influences now. We talked a little bit about it before on New York English. What are some of the predominant ethnic groups now that are maybe changing the way we're all speaking?
Well, Spanish. So there's words that maybe are entering besides bodega, which is the one that everybody knows. There's a few that are coming in, probably papi chulo, more people are getting familiar with. That's sort of like or mami chula, that's sort of like a hot young guy or woman who's knows they're sexy. And that's a term which when I ask my students, like half of them tend to know it, even if they're not from a Spanish-speaking background. There are words from in New York right now, a halal. Very typically what happens, in a word is borrowed, it often changes its meaning. So in New York, a halal doesn't refer to any food that is kosher in the Muslim religion. It refers to a certain, something that comes off of a halal cart, one of these food carts which say halal food on them. So people will say, I'm going to go get a halal. African-American English is certainly spreading in. So you hear a lot of New Yorkers using instead of the you guys, the traditional plural that we've always used in the North, you'll hear not y'all, but ya. So ya want to go? That's you plural want to go. And that comes originally from the South, but then through African Americans. So there's a lot of more recent influences from immigrant groups, but also from groups that have really been in New York for a long time.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're talking about these contemporary changes, because that's something that people don't often think about, is that language is always changing. And so this conversation is different now than it would have been 10 years ago. I didn't know about a halal. That's really interesting. And actually, that reminds me of a number of words in Jewish English that have changed in their meanings when they have spread beyond Jewish networks, like the word schmooze, for example. What do you understand schmooze to mean, Andrew?
To chat casually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too. But most non-Jews would say it means to kiss up, to work your way up the social or professional hierarchy. And it also has become transitive. You schmooze someone. You don't just schmooze with someone. And so this is an example of how a word is changing as it spreads beyond its original community.
So I'm going to urge anyone in the audience, if you have a question for either of our guests, please put it in the chat and I'll try to get to it. There is a lot of talk in the chat about where people grew up and the variations. Michael, you're skeptical that there are wide variations among the 5 boroughs of New York. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, it's a common belief, but no one has ever shown that to be the case or really been able to identify people by boroughs when they're just recorded. So a faculty member now who's now in Oregon but did her dissertation at NYU has a borough quiz. People, you hear a couple of recordings and you're asked what borough they're from, and it comes out fairly random. So there's really no evidence of that, but there is social class differences and ethnic differences. So there's probably some differences within this big major differences that are associated with racial groups, which isn't to say that every white person sounds white or every black person sounds black or every Asian person sounds Asian, but and of course Latinx sounds Latino, or it's not. It doesn't quite work that way, but people will, at above average rates, are able to pick out someone's racial identity, and even with Asian Americans. So that's a major change. And then within, I don't know what I'm hearing on, to be honest, although this is my profession, but some people just sound very Irish New York, and some people sound very Italian New York. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they'll try to sound Jewish, and they won't pull it off.
Someone has a question. It goes back to where I started with Philip Roth growing up in New Jersey, and by the 1940s, he said his folks were not speaking in a New York accent. Are there any studies of differences between New York and New Jersey accents? Actually,
the New York accent, the New York dialect region goes to the Passaic River Valley. That is to say, the Meadowlands. You go through the Lincoln Tunnel, for example, you get to the Meadowlands, that's the limit. And after that, New Jersey and Newark's on the other side of that. So you wouldn't expect Newark to sound exactly like New York. And to me, when you listen to a Jewish or Italian Newarker, they don't, to me, sound New York, although I think it's been claimed that they do. It's always been different. There was work back in 1960s, a very famous master's thesis, which looked at northern New Jersey and how it changed slowly over just an area of like 10 miles. Mm. And I did a study comparing that with where the word hero for sandwich disappears as you go into New Jersey. And by the time you're in, say, Patterson area, it's mostly sub sandwich. But But of course, now sub is coming into New York and ruining us.
Right. You could blame Subway for that.
Oh yeah, it's awful.
Damn them. Sarah, a question the other direction, and I don't know if this is beyond your expertise, but in New York Yiddish, does English come in, in a way that changes, right? How much English vocabulary makes it into Yiddish speakers in Brooklyn or in Monsey or in Kiryas Yoel?
Yeah, well, it sounds like you're asking specifically about Hasidic or Haredi Yiddish. Because if you were asking about Yiddishist Yiddish, the answer would be very little, because Yiddishists are interested in speaking purely Yiddish because they want to keep the language alive. And this is people who aren't Hasidic but are speaking Yiddish in some everyday interactions. But if you're talking about Hasidic Jews, there's a lot of English influence. It's what's called translanguaging in linguistics, which means mixing languages together. And so what we think of as English and Yiddish, they just think of as the way they speak, right? And that's true for any bilingual community. And since Hasidic communities in New York are mostly bilingual, they have a lot of translanguaging with English and Yiddish, and there are grammatical influences from English on their Yiddish, such that Hasidic Jews in America and Hasidic Jews in Israel and in Belgium sometimes have a little bit of trouble understanding each other. They can basically understand each other because they're speaking Yiddish, but the English influences and the Hebrew influences, et cetera, make their languages kind of different. Also, somebody was asking about the word challah. Chali.
Yeah.
Address that.
So I grew up with chali, and then someone else mentions latki. So where does that come from? That variation?
Yeah. So in Yiddish, the word is chale and latke. It's kind of a little s sound, but more like a schwa, like a short version of that vowel. And that vowel doesn't exist in English at the end of a word. So either you can say or you can say e. And some of the Yiddish words that had that vowel became e, like bubby and zaidi, although some people also say baba and zeta, right? And then chala and chali were competing forms for a while, and then chala basically won out, and same with latka. And that may also have to do with the writing of it, because if it's not written with an IE or a Y, then if it's written with an A, then people are going to pronounce it how it's written to some extent. You also get this with names, where you have Nechama becomes Nechami, right? And so that E at the end of names is both that Yiddish vowel, but also the influence of the English suffix that you use for nicknames, like Jennifer becoming Jenny or Bobby, right?
Right. Michael, there's some questions about, I grew up, if you weren't Italian, you were Jewish. If you weren't Jewish, you were Italian. That was the kind of suburb I grew up in. Are there variations between the speech of Jewish New Yorkers and Italian New Yorkers that are noticeable?
Well, it's again going back to the 60s. There was a study by William Lebov, who found differences that, for example, the Jewish New Yorkers would have a really strong thought, but the Italians would do thoughts. Maybe they would raise it. They would have it somewhat like in that direction. And then the Italians would have a very strong, like kiesh, and the Jews would also do cash, but not quite as strong. I think I got that right. Maybe I got it backwards, but I can't imagine that's still around. I think it's more in intonation patterns than anything else, but that no one that I know of has really done a thorough look at those differences. So if somebody wants to come study if you're young, study at Queens College. If you're a little older, go to the Graduate Center, or we'll set you to work on that. No one's really examined that in much detail.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned intonation, because that is something that I've heard Orthodox Jews say they can tell, let's say they're listening to the radio and it's a call-in show. They can often tell when someone is Orthodox just based on their intonation. And, sometimes it's very profound, like, if you've heard it, you know what I'm talking about. But sometimes it's more subtle, like, if you've heard it, you know what I'm talking about. And I'm not doing it exactly right, but there are very distinctive intonation patterns in Orthodox communities.
Right. I've heard that on the Brian Lehrer show on WNYC. I immediately know, oh, yeah, person, because he has quite a number of listeners from the Orthodox listeners.
Here's a question a little bit about your methodology. And do we have any sense what New York English sounded like before the mass Jewish immigration of the 1880, 1920, let's say? And I don't know how you would I don't know how early recordings came into be, or just if there were linguists marking in those days how people spoke.
Well, that's another thing. I'd love to get somebody to go out and try to find all those early recordings of people like Teddy Roosevelt or people of that generation. There aren't many of those recordings, of course, around. And the quality of the recordings isn't very good. But still, we could get some interesting data about that. There's a very sketchy study by a very early dialectologist around 1902, 1903. So he would be looking at people born around maybe starting in the 1830s, 1850s. And that's all we have that's early. The rest of it is like trying to see, well, this is what it sounds like now, and this is what people have talked about. So we assume certain pronunciations. I'll say the basis of the New York vowel system goes back to the early English settlers. That's pretty clear, just because of the way that it's shaped and the way it fits in with other East Coast vowel systems. So it was clearly the first settlers that set the stage for things like the thought vowel. That comes from that and evolved from what it was.
We touched on this a little bit, but I just want to clarify. I've always been told accents are on the way out because of the homogenizing influence of television and broadcast and all that. But is the New York accent fading, disappearing, or changing in a way that people won't recognize it as the New York accent, the cliched New York accent?
Those stereotypical features are clearly in decline, like the R-lessness, my way of pronouncing those vowels, the cash. I mean, every year there's fewer students that use those in our and we really noticed this about 10 years ago to now. It was a sharp change between the millennials and the Gen Zers. On the other hand, new features are arising. New Yorkers, you just have to get on a plane and go anywhere else, and people don't sound the same. So we wouldn't want to say that New York dialect is disappearing. We would want to say that it's changing, and that some of these very distinctive features are in decline.
Another question is about the role of anti-Semitism in maybe suppressing the way Jews might speak as they leave the bubble of the New York area. Is there been any talk of or studies of how perceptions about the language have shaped the language of Jews as they move out of their out of the safety of their own communities?
Not yet, but that would be a very interesting study. I did that survey that I gave you some data from before was from 2008, and maybe I'll do it again in 2028 or something like that. And the question about code switching and anti-Semitism would be relevant. So my sense is that people might be tailoring their speech, but also that they would be, because of anti-Semitism, are expressing pride in their Jewishness, especially in community internal conversations. And so I would expect that Jewish speech might become a bit more distinct in-group conversations because of that pride.
Sarah, I also like to ask you, because it is my favorite project, and I've actually contributed to it. You're the Jewish English Lexicon. Just tell us a little bit about it. If people don't know what it is, it's a online crowdsourced dictionary of all the Jewish words that are making their way into English. And what is, and I think there's a portrait there that it's just bigger than Ashkenazi, which I think is, I worry in an hour like this, we're talking about Ashkenazi as the default way of being Jewish. But I think the lexicon tries to show all the different kinds of languages that are making it into the everyday vocabulary of Jews, some secular, some religious, and everybody in between.
Sure, yeah, I can show it to you. So this is the Jewish English Lexicon. It's a dictionary, and it's here. Let's just look at a random list of words. You can see a bunch of words from different languages, and each entry has recordings like
Mirpea, Marp,
with different pronunciations of the word and who uses it and the regions that it's used in. But you can also search for different types of people who tend to use certain words. So like, for example, if we search for Sephardi Jews, we'll get a bunch of words from Ladino, from Judeo-Arabic, etc., from Hebrew. So for example, you get basari, or psari, which is, a word meaning fleishik, in my way of saying it. And
which is meat for people who don't know either word.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. And you can also add words to the lexicon. You can also search by language of origin. So if you're just looking at Yiddish words, you can see a bunch of Yiddish words and Hebrew words. So that's the Jewish English Lexicon. It's all moderated. So anyone who submits an entry, we have experts working on it to determine if it's actually used or just submitted as a joke.
Right. And the key is that these are words in English, as opposed, like, Bli Neder, I'll have the schedule posted by Friday, which means I'm not making any promises or vows, but right.
Yes, and we have similar websites for Jewish, Latin American Spanish, Russian, Swedish. A new one is going to launch soon with German. We just recently launched Portuguese. So there are in communities that Jews migrated to, countries that Jews migrated to in the last century or two, they have created new distinctive ways of speaking those languages, and that's what we're documenting.
Right. And Michael, you have a project too. Tell us a little. It's the Corpus, which is probably, I think it's a more technical tool, but how is that useful for scholars and lay people?
Well, it's not available for lay people, and it's not really completed yet. It's kind of, we're getting to the end of getting it ready for everyone to, people would, scholars would look at it. There are recordings mostly by CUNY students, so they went out and they recorded people. So there's a high representation of people born in the 90s, and it's people of all backgrounds. So we've been doing research with it, mainly on pronunciation, but now we're doing some stuff with code switching. We're looking at, people have looked at different attitudes towards New York City English, and that are appearing in these recordings. People are asked to talk about that towards the end. But a lot of it is on like vowels and how it's changing over time. Some of the recordings are from the Bronx Oral History Project, which was a series of recordings done in the 1980s by Lehman College students talking to older neighbors, talking to their older neighborhoods. And so we have, a nice time depth. It's basically a resource for study of language, although it might be of interest to sociologists, anthropologists, oral historians in general.
So we always like to leave people with homework. So I'm going to ask you each maybe for a recommendation of a few books or resources to understand more about this topic. So Michael, I'll start with you.
Well, I could plug my book. It's a little technical, but it's really designed for say, undergraduate linguistics students, I would say. What else? In terms of the article that you mentioned at the beginning, Deborah Tannen's famous for us. She's written, if you just Google her name and conversational style, it can be very enlightening about maybe some conflicts that you've had. I mean, that's always been Deborah Tannen's bailiwick, is like looking at how conflicts arise. And this is an interesting study of a Thanksgiving dinner and what went wrong and what went right. What else? If you really want to get into the weeds, Bill Lubov's book, Social Stratification of English New York City, is what set up the whole field of variationist sociolinguistics.
Sarah, recommendations?
Well, I guess I'll plug the Jewish language website. If you're interested in learning more about Jewish languages more generally, we do have a page on Jewish English there, and there are pages on many other languages that Jews have spoken throughout history. And if you're preparing for Passover, we have a whole exhibit on Passover, and you can use our PowerPoint Haggadah and multilingual Haggadah supplement. And we also have videos of Passover songs and excerpts in many different Jewish languages. And if you follow the Jewish Language Project on social media, you can see the links on the bottom of that website. You can get access to the fun facts that we share every week and the word of the week from the Jewish English lexicon. And we're also going to be doing a multilingual Omer counter.
Oh, nice. So if maybe, are you able to maybe drop that link into the chat for folks while
Yeah, I just did.
And then one recommendation I had, I hope it's E.J. White wrote a book called You Talking to Me, The Unruly History of New York English, which I found very useful in preparing for this, and fascinating. It's where I found out that the some parts of New York accent used to be high class before they weren't. I see a lot of people.
I want to plug one website from a colleague of mine.
Sure.
Did I do the right one? Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is the Endangered Language Alliance.
Yeah.
And a number of these languages are Jewish languages, such as Bukharian, of course, Tat, which is the language of the mountain Jews from Azerbaijan, and probably Judeo-Persian, although I don't think that's really considered as endangered. But
the Iranian, they do have several projects on Iranian languages like Judeo-Shirazi, Judeo-Kashani, and Judeo-Esfahani, and we're working with them. They're one of the partners in the Jewish Language Consortium. So yeah, I think this is, if we're thinking about New York language, we also have to think about the many endangered languages that are spoken in New York.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank both of our guests. I want to thank Sarah Benor and Michael Newman for a really fascinating hour. I've noticed people said in the chat there should be more like this. There will be more like this. Come back to the Jewish Week website and to 70 Faces Media. We're going to have sessions on Jewish stuff, the tchotchkes that we all collect and what do they mean, and many more interesting chats to come. So I want to thank you all for taking part, thanking our guests, and